Hey everyone! Today we're tackling a question most history channels won't touch. How Roman elites weaponized sexual humiliation as a political tool. Forget the sanitized version. The truth is stranger and more revealing about how power actually worked in the ancient world. If you're into sharp, no-nonsense history, hit subscribe, tap like, and tell me in the comments what fact about this story you want debunked. Now, let's dive in. Picture yourself in the Roman Forum, polished marble, imposing columns, and beneath the veneer of civilization, a political battlefield where reputation was everything and almost nothing was off limits. But you can drop the visualization now. I'm not here to paint pretty pictures, just to drag the messy truth into the light. When we talk about Roman politics, we usually focus on military campaigns, legislative maneuvers, or dramatic assassinations. But there was another, more insidious battlefield: reputation warfare. And sexual humiliation was perhaps the most devastating weapon in that arsenal. Roman political life operated on a simple but brutal premise. A man's public standing, his dignitas, was his most valuable asset. Lose it, and you might as well lose your citizenship. And nothing could corrode dignitas faster than accusations of sexual impropriety, especially suggestions that a man had surrendered his masculine dominance either by being passive in sexual encounters or by being excessively controlled by women. This wasn't just personal. In a society where public and private behavior were seen as direct reflections of each other, a man who couldn't control his household or his bodily integrity couldn't be trusted to govern the state. The bedroom and the Senate were viewed through the same lens of power, control, and hierarchy. And here's where many historians get it wrong. These weren't just crude insults or locker room talk. This was calculated, precision-guided character assassination, often deployed at strategic moments to derail political careers, scuttle legislation, or neutralize opponents without resorting to actual violence. Take the case of Julius Caesar, a name we associate with military genius and political ambition. But early in his career, he nearly saw everything unravel because of a carefully engineered humiliation campaign. And no, I'm not talking about the more famous every woman's man and every man's woman jab. That came later. I'm talking about an episode that nearly ended his rise before it really began. Around 80 BCE, the young Caesar was sent as a diplomatic envoy to the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. His mission was successful on paper, but when he returned to Rome, whispers began circulating that he had secured the alliance by serving as the king's passive sexual partner. This wasn't random gossip. Caesar's political opponents, particularly the conservative optimates who opposed his populist leanings, recognized that the ambitious young man with his fashionable style and aristocratic connections represented a threat to their power, and they pounced. The rumors were spread through every channel available in pre-internet Rome: graffiti, public speeches, drinking songs, and crude verses. Caesar's nickname became the Queen of Bithynia. When he later conquered Gaul, his troops sang bawdy songs during his triumph, suggesting that while Caesar had conquered the Gauls, Nicomedes had conquered Caesar. You might think this was just crude humor, but it was devastatingly effective political warfare. So damaging were these allegations that they dogged Caesar throughout his entire career. This wasn't just a temporary embarrassment, but a permanent stain on his reputation that required constant management. The brilliance of this attack wasn't in its sophistication, but in its impossible-to-disprove nature. How exactly does one prove a negative regarding private encounters that allegedly happened in a foreign palace? The accusation created a no-win scenario. Dignified silence could be interpreted as tacit admission, while vehement denial could make Caesar appear overly defensive and draw more attention to the rumors. Even Cicero, that master of rhetoric, weaponized these rumors against Caesar in the Senate, making not-so-subtle references that drew knowing laughter from the assembled senators. And Caesar, for all his political acumen, could never fully neutralize the stain. he could only attempt to compensate by emphasizing his numerous affairs with women, particularly with the wives of his political rivals, to reassert his masculine credentials. But this was just one example of how Roman elites turned private acts, real or invented, into political ammunition. And as we'll see, this form of character assassination was refined into an art form as the Republic gave way to empire. The effectiveness of sexual humiliation as a political weapon in Rome stemmed from something more profound than mere prudishness. It was rooted in the Roman concept of virtues, not quite the same as our virtue, but rather a complex package of qualities that defined ideal Roman manhood: courage, discipline, self-mastery, and above all, dominance. For the Roman elite male, being the penetrative partner in any sexual encounter was the only acceptable role. It aligned with his expected social dominance. To be penetrated was to be like a woman or a slave, categories with diminished legal and social standing. So accusations of passivity weren't just embarrassing. They were existential threats that called into question a man's fundamental right to participate in public life. And let me tell you, modern political attack ads have nothing on Roman character assassination. Today's candidates worry about awkward photos or embarrassing gaffes. Roman politicians had to contend with accusations that could strip them of their basic social identity. Now, the masters of this dark art understood something crucial. The more specific and vivid the accusation, the more it stuck in public memory. Vague rumors could be dismissed, detailed scenarios lodged in the collective imagination like splinters. Take Clodius Pulcher, one of the most notorious political operators of the late Republic. He was an aristocrat who rebranded himself as a populist leader. Think of him as a patrician who decided to play for the plebeian team when he realized that's where the real power was shifting. Clodius had a talent for manufacturing scandals, but he also became the target of one of the most elaborate humiliation campaigns in Roman history. In 62 BCE, he infiltrated the women-only festival of the Bona Dea, allegedly disguised as a female musician, supposedly to pursue an affair with Caesar's wife, Pompeia. He was caught, and the incident exploded into a major religious and political scandal. Caesar divorced Pompeia with the famous line that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, even while claiming he didn't necessarily believe the accusations. But here's the fascinating part that often gets overlooked. Clodius's enemies, particularly Cicero, transformed this scandal into something far more damaging than a mere religious transgression. They reframed the narrative to suggest that Clodius had disguised himself as a woman not to seduce a woman, but because this feminine disguise reflected his true nature. Cicero repeatedly referred to Clodius as pulchellus puer, pretty little boy, and made pointed references to his supposed passive sexual relationships with other men. The implication was clear. A man who would dress as a woman was betraying his fundamental nature as a Roman man, and therefore couldn't be trusted with power. And you think modern political discourse gets ugly? During Clodius's trial, Cicero deliberately destroyed his alibi by testifying that Clodius had been in Rome on the day of the Bona Dea incident, not, as Clodius claimed, miles away in Interamna. This wasn't just legal testimony, it was a calculated move in an ongoing political war. Clodius never forgot this slight. When he later gained political power as tribune of the plebs, he engineered legislation specifically designed to force Cicero into exile. The personal had become intensely political, but what's truly revealing is how these humiliation campaigns often worked both ways. After returning from exile, Cicero delivered his speech Pro Caelio, defending his young protege Marcus Caelius Rufus against charges of political violence. Part of Cicero's defense strategy was to launch a counterattack against Clodius's sister, Clodia Metelli, portraying her as a promiscuous widow using her sexuality to manipulate younger men for political purposes. Cicero dubbed her the Medea of the Palatine and the Clodia the Quadrantarian. the latter nickname suggesting she charged a quadrans, a tiny copper coin, for her sexual services, effectively calling her the cheapest prostitute in Rome. This wasn't just misogyny for its own sake. It was a calculated attempt to damage Clodius by attacking his family's honor and suggesting he couldn't maintain proper control over his female relatives. The genius of these attacks was their asymmetrical nature. They created damage far out of proportion to the effort required to launch them. A single well-placed rumor could neutralize years of carefully built political capital. And while some of these attacks seem almost comically crude to modern ears, they worked because they exploited fundamental Roman anxieties about gender, power, and self-control. A man who couldn't control his body couldn't control the body politic. As we navigate deeper into the swamp of Roman reputation warfare, let's talk about why this stuff matters beyond mere historical curiosity. These weren't just ancient smear campaigns. They reveal how deeply sexual politics was intertwined with actual politics in a society that we've inherited so much from. And if you're thinking, well, that was just the chaotic republic, hold on to your toga. When Rome transformed from republic to empire, these tactics didn't disappear. They evolved into even more sophisticated forms of political control. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, understood the power of sexual reputation better than anyone. After all, he had seized power in part by positioning himself as the defender of traditional Roman morality against the supposedly decadent lifestyle of Mark Antony, who had fallen under the spell of the foreign queen Cleopatra. But Augustus didn't just use sexual politics as a weapon, he institutionalized it. His moral legislation, the Leges Juliae of 18 to 17 BCE, didn't just regulate marriage and reproduction. It created a legal framework where sexual behavior became a matter of explicit state concern. Adultery, once a private matter, became a public crime with serious legal consequences, particularly for women. This wasn't just puritanical moralizing, it was strategic. By positioning himself as the guardian of Roman sexual virtue, Augustus could frame opposition to his rule as opposition to traditional morality itself. It was a brilliantly effective form of political control disguised as moral restoration. And now we arrive at one of history's master practitioners of sexual humiliation as statecraft, Tiberius, Rome's second emperor. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege that Tiberius was a sexual deviant who retreated to the island of Capri to indulge his perversions away from the judging eyes of Rome. Scholars consider this contested. But what's more historically solid is how Tiberius weaponized accusations of sexual impropriety against his political enemies. The case of Agrippina the Elder illustrates this perfectly. Agrippina was the granddaughter of Augustus, wife of the popular general Germanicus, and mother to a brood of potential heirs to the throne. She was also outspoken, proud of her bloodline, and not particularly inclined to show deference to Tiberius, whom she likely viewed as less legitimate than her own sons. After her husband's mysterious death, possibly poisoned on Tiberius's orders, though that remains speculative, Agrippina became increasingly vocal in promoting her sons as true heirs to Augustus's legacy. This made her dangerous. Rather than directly eliminating her, Tiberius deployed a more insidious strategy. He had his ally Sejanus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect, orchestrate a whisper campaign suggesting that Agrippina was engaged in inappropriate relationships with ambitious senators, using her sexuality to build a coalition against the emperor. The beauty of this approach was its dual effect. It undermined Agrippina's moral authority while simultaneously intimidating any male senators who might support her. Who would risk being named as her lover and facing treason charges? Eventually, Tiberius had Agrippina charged with treason and exiled to the island of Pandataria, where she died, reportedly from self-imposed starvation. Her son Nero, not the infamous emperor but his uncle, was exiled on similar charges, while another son, Drusus, was imprisoned in Rome. This was character assassination elevated to an art form, not just damaging reputations, but physically eliminating political threats while maintaining a veneer of legal propriety. But perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner of humiliation politics was Tiberius's successor, Caligula. Now, Caligula's reputation has reached almost mythical status as the poster boy for imperial excess and cruelty. Much of what we know about him comes from hostile sources writing decades after his assassination. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege that Caligula engaged in sexual relationships with the wives of senators and other elite men, sometimes at official banquets. Scholars consider this contested. What's particularly interesting about these allegations isn't whether they're literally true, but how they reflect a specifically Roman understanding of how power could be expressed through sexual domination. By allegedly taking the wives of senators, Caligula wasn't just satisfying desire. He was demonstrating his absolute power over the men who were supposedly sharing governance with him. One particularly revealing anecdote involves Caligula's treatment of Valerius Catullus, a young man from a respected family who boasted publicly about his sexual relationship with the emperor. Rather than denying the potentially damaging rumor, Caligula allegedly summoned Catullus to his palace and staged an elaborate farce. He treated the young man as if he were a woman, complete with feminine nicknames, and loudly asked others for advice on Catullus's wifely duties. The message was unmistakable. Caligula was demonstrating that even in supposedly passive sexual roles, he remained the dominant party. He was inverting the expected shame and redirecting it toward Catullus, who had attempted to gain status through association with the emperor. Whether this specific incident happened exactly as described is less important than what it reveals about how Romans understood the connection between sexual and political dominance. Humiliation wasn't just a byproduct of political conflict. It was a deliberate strategy for maintaining hierarchies of power. Let's talk about how these humiliation campaigns actually worked on a tactical level. This wasn't random mudslinging, it was precision political warfare with clearly defined objectives, methodologies, and success metrics. The most effective Roman political humiliation followed a specific template. Identify the target's most valued aspect of their public persona, then craft an attack that specifically undermines that particular strength. It's political jujitsu, using the target's weight against them. Consider Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's premier orator and a new man, novus homo, the first in his family to reach the Senate. Cicero's entire political identity was built around his rhetorical brilliance and incorruptible defense of the Republic's traditions. His lack of noble ancestry meant he compensated by being more traditionally Roman than the Romans. So when Publius Clodius wanted to destroy him, he didn't just attack randomly. He crafted legislation that forced Cicero into a no-win situation where he'd either have to flee Rome, abandoning his cherished position as defender of the Republic, or face execution for his earlier execution of Roman citizens without trial during the Catilinarian conspiracy. The humiliation was exquisite in its precision. The man who had built his identity around saving the Republic was forced to abandon Rome to save himself. And Clodius didn't stop there. He had Cicero's properties confiscated and his beloved house on the Palatine demolished, replacing it with a shrine to liberty. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. The self-proclaimed defender of liberty had been replaced by liberty itself. But sexual humiliation had particular potency in the Roman context because it attacked something more fundamental than political position. It undermined a man's basic social identity. Roman masculinity wasn't just about biological sex. It was an achieved status that required constant performance and could be lost. This explains why passive sexual behavior was treated as so damaging to reputation. It wasn't just about the act itself, but what it symbolized. A failure to maintain the active dominant role expected of a Roman man, particularly an elite one. And let's not kid ourselves, this wasn't just about sex. It was about power, dominance, and social control. The same dynamics played out in non-sexual contexts, too. Take the practice of naming a man in a will only to insult him, forcing him to attend the public reading of the will to discover he'd been humiliated rather than enriched. This practice became so common that Augustus eventually passed legislation against it. The effectiveness of sexual humiliation as a political tactic explains its remarkable persistence throughout Roman history. Even as the political system transformed from republic to principate to dominate, the basic template remained. Identify vulnerability, craft a narrative that exploits it, disseminate through available channels, and watch your opponent scramble to defend the indefensible. The channels for these attacks evolved over time but maintained certain constants. In the Republican period, the primary vehicles were public oratory, particularly in the courts and Senate, political graffiti, and privately circulated verses. An accusation launched in the Senate carried particular weight, as it was delivered in a setting of official authority to an audience of the target's peers. During the imperial period, with the Senate's importance diminished, the imperial court became the crucial arena for reputation warfare. Whispers to the emperor or his key advisors could be more dangerous than public accusations, as they might trigger formal investigations for treason, maiestas, which had been expanded to include a remarkably broad range of offenses. By the time of Nero, the system had evolved into something approaching a formalized protocol. Accusations would be brought to the emperor, an investigation would follow, often with foregone conclusions, and the target would typically be offered the courtesy of suicide rather than public execution. This leads us to one of the most dramatic examples of engineered humiliation: Nero's campaign against his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina had helped secure the throne for her son, likely participated in the poisoning of her husband, Emperor Claudius, and initially exercised considerable influence over Nero's rule. But as Nero grew into his power, he chafed under his mother's control and determined to break free. Rather than simply having her killed, a move that might cast him as impious in a society that officially revered motherhood, Nero embarked on a systematic campaign to undermine Agrippina's reputation and isolate her politically. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege that Nero spread rumors that Agrippina had attempted to seduce him, her own son, in a desperate bid to maintain her influence. Scholars consider this contested. Whether true or not, what makes this accusation particularly noteworthy is its inversion of power dynamics. By portraying his politically powerful mother as sexually desperate, Nero reframed their relationship. He wasn't an ungrateful son rejecting his mother's counsel, but a virtuous Roman man resisting inappropriate advances. This reframing gave him moral cover for what came next: Agrippina's murder, disguised as a sailing accident. And while many Romans likely suspected the truth, the preceding humiliation campaign had sufficiently damaged Agrippina's standing that her death provoked limited backlash. The pattern repeats throughout Roman history: character assassination as prelude to actual elimination. By the time the target was physically removed, they had already been symbolically killed in the public imagination. We're now going to explore what might be the most sophisticated deployment of sexual humiliation in Roman history: the campaign against Empress Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius. This case reveals how humiliation could be used not just to attack individuals, but to reshape political narratives and justify regime changes. Valeria Messalina married Claudius before he became emperor and bore him 2 children, including his son Britannicus. As empress, she accumulated considerable influence, particularly over appointments and access to the emperor. By all accounts, she was ambitious and effective at court politics, which made her dangerous to certain factions. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege that Messalina was sexually insatiable, taking multiple lovers and even challenging a famous prostitute to a contest to see who could entertain more men in a single night. Scholars consider this contested. These allegations reached their climax with the claim that while Claudius was away from Rome, Messalina actually conducted a formal marriage ceremony with her lover Gaius Silius, a handsome young consul designate from a noble family. When informed of this, Claudius's freedmen advisors, particularly Narcissus, convinced the emperor that this wasn't merely infidelity, but the first step in a coup attempt. Messalina and Silius were executed, along with various alleged accomplices. But here's where it gets interesting from a political perspective. Who benefited most from Messalina's fall? Agrippina the Younger, sister of Caligula, niece of Claudius, and mother of the future emperor Nero. Shortly after Messalina's execution, Agrippina married her uncle Claudius, after he conveniently changed Roman law to permit uncle-niece marriages, and positioned her son Nero as heir apparent, displacing Claudius's biological son Britannicus. The question historians have wrestled with is, to what extent was the scandalous narrative about Messalina engineered by Agrippina and her faction to eliminate a rival power center? The alleged behavior ascribed to Messalina is so outrageous, particularly the formal marriage to Silius while still married to the emperor, that many scholars suspect significant exaggeration, if not outright fabrication. What makes this case particularly revealing is how sexual behavior was used as a proxy for political reliability. Messalina's alleged sexual excess wasn't just portrayed as a personal failing, but as evidence of broader political untrustworthiness. A woman who couldn't control her body couldn't be trusted with proximity to imperial power. This wasn't unique to Messalina. Throughout Roman history, we see sexual behavior consistently framed as a direct reflection of political character. The bedroom was not private. It was a proving ground for public capacity. For women in imperial circles, the stakes of this conflation were particularly high. Roman society allowed elite women certain avenues for exercising power, but these were always precarious and could be abruptly closed if they were perceived as transgressing sexual boundaries. The Messalina narrative has cast such a long shadow that it's difficult to recover any historically accurate portrait of the actual woman behind the propaganda. What we know with more certainty is that her elimination cleared the path for one of the most consequential successions in Roman history, the accession of Nero, and significantly reshaped the Julio-Claudian dynasty. This brings us to a broader pattern worth noting: how sexual humiliation was often deployed at key transitional moments in Roman political history. Major regime changes were frequently preceded or accompanied by sexual scandals that helped justify the transfer of power. Augustus's rise was aided by portraying Mark Antony as sexually subjugated to Cleopatra. Tiberius's increasingly authoritarian rule was justified partly by narratives of moral decay among the elite. Caligula's assassination came after stories of his sexual excesses had thoroughly undermined his standing with the Praetorian Guard and Senate. This isn't coincidental. Sexual humiliation was particularly effective during transitions because it helped resolve one of the central tensions in Roman political culture: the conflict between the need for powerful leadership and the fear of kings or tyrants. By framing political opposition in sexual terms, Romans could avoid directly confronting questions about the nature of imperial power itself. It wasn't the concentration of authority that was problematic, but rather the character flaws of specific individuals who abused that authority, a distinction that allowed the system to survive even as individual emperors fell. This dynamic continued well into the later empire. Consider the Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian in the 6th century Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. Fast-forward comparison note, outside our core period, included briefly for context. Before her imperial marriage, Theodora allegedly worked as a performer and prostitute, details enthusiastically recorded by the historian Procopius in his Secret History, a text so scandalous it remained unpublished during his lifetime. Procopius's account of Theodora's past is so luridly detailed that modern historians view it with significant skepticism. What's noteworthy isn't the veracity of the claims, but how sexual history was deployed as a political weapon even centuries after the period we've been examining. Theodora was a powerful political actor who influenced significant legislation, particularly laws improving the status of women. Procopius's attacks on her sexual history weren't just prudish moralizing. They were attempts to undermine her political authority by attacking her moral standing. The remarkable consistency of this tactic across centuries suggests it wasn't just cultural prejudice, but a recognized and effective political strategy, one that targeted men and women in different but equally devastating ways. So far, we've focused primarily on how sexual humiliation was deployed against political targets in Rome. But now let's examine the mechanics of how these campaigns were crafted and executed. Who were the architects behind them? What skills and resources did they need, and how did targets attempt to defend themselves? The most effective humiliation campaigns weren't spontaneous outbursts, but carefully orchestrated operations that combined multiple channels of attack. They typically involved three key elements: a core narrative, multiple dissemination channels, and strategic timing. The core narrative needed to be simple enough to be easily remembered, but detailed enough to seem credible. The best attacks contained specific details that made them difficult to dismiss as generic slander. When Clodius attacked Cicero, he didn't just call him corrupt. He pointed to specific actions during the Catilinarian conspiracy that could be framed as illegal executions without trial. Dissemination channels varied depending on the period and target audience. For attacks aimed at influencing the Senate or equestrian class, formal oratory was the premium channel. Cicero's Philippics against Mark Antony represent perhaps the most sophisticated example, 14 formal speeches that systematically dismantled Antony's public image, portraying him as a drunken, debauched enemy of the Republic. For reaching a broader audience, different tactics were required. Political graffiti was surprisingly important in Rome. The walls of Pompeii preserve numerous examples of political messages, including sexual allegations against candidates for local office. Popular verses and songs could spread accusations through the lower classes, while targeted dinner party gossip could circulate rumors among the elite. Timing was perhaps the most crucial element. The most effective campaigns launched their attacks at moments when the target was already vulnerable. During election campaigns, immediately before important votes or military commands, or during succession crises. But who actually created these campaigns? While the historical record often credits prominent figures like Cicero or Octavian, the future Augustus, with devastating attacks on their rivals, the reality was likely more complex. Behind the scenes operated networks of what we might call opposition researchers, ghostwriters, and rumor specialists. Prominent among these were a class of professionals known as delatores, informers, who became particularly important during the early empire. These individuals specialized in bringing accusations against wealthy or prominent citizens, often receiving a portion of the condemned person's property as reward. While some delatores focused on legitimate legal violations, others effectively functioned as professional character assassins, gathering compromising information and crafting narratives that could destroy their targets. The most successful became wealthy and feared, though rarely respected. Supporting these specialists were networks of slaves and freedmen who functioned as both intelligence gatherers and rumor spreaders. Household slaves had unique access to the private lives of the elite and could provide damaging information to rivals. This vulnerability to surveillance from within was one reason why trust within Roman households was so highly valued, and why accusations of disloyalty among slaves and freedmen feature prominently in many political scandals. The poet Ovid's case illustrates how these networks operated. In 8 CE, Augustus abruptly exiled Ovid to Tomis on the Black Sea, a harsh punishment that effectively ended his literary career. The stated reasons were Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. The poem was likely his Ars Amatoria, the art of love, which could be interpreted as undermining Augustus's moral legislation. But the mistake remains mysterious. Many scholars suspect Ovid had witnessed or possessed information about sexual misconduct in the imperial family, possibly involving Augustus's granddaughter Julia the Younger, who was exiled around the same time. What makes this case notable is how it demonstrates the stakes of sexual politics in imperial Rome. Even an established poet from the equestrian order could be summarily banished if he threatened the carefully constructed moral narrative surrounding the imperial family. But targets weren't entirely defenseless against these attacks. Counter-strategies fell into several categories. Denial and counterattack was the most direct approach. When Caesar faced rumors about his relationship with King Nicomedes, he not only denied them, but launched counter-accusations against his accusers. This approach had mixed effectiveness. Denials could draw more attention to the original allegations. Preemptive disclosure could diffuse potential attacks. Some politicians would acknowledge and even joke about potentially embarrassing information before opponents could weaponize it. This approach required significant rhetorical skill to frame the disclosure advantageously. Character witnesses and public displays of traditional virtue could help rebuild damaged reputations. After facing accusations of effeminacy early in his career, Caesar made a point of publicly emphasizing his relationships with women, particularly the wives of political rivals, a strategy that reasserted his masculine dominance while also humiliating his opponents. Finally, retreating from public life was sometimes the only viable option. For those whose reputations had been irreparably damaged, voluntary exile could prevent further humiliation and preserve the possibility of eventual rehabilitation. Many chose this path, establishing themselves in provincial cities where they could maintain a standard of living while avoiding the intense scrutiny of Rome. What's particularly fascinating is how these attacks and counterattacks created a kind of feedback loop in Roman political culture. The more important reputation became, the more vulnerable politicians were to reputational damage, which in turn made reputation even more crucial to protect. This dynamic helps explain why Roman politics became increasingly vicious over time. By the late Republic, character assassination wasn't just one tactic among many. It had become the default mode of political combat, with policy disagreements frequently framed in terms of personal moral failings. Let's shift our focus to examine how these humiliation tactics evolved during the transition from Republic to Empire, a period when the stakes of political combat changed dramatically, and with them, the nature of reputation warfare. During the Republic, sexual humiliation was primarily a horizontal weapon deployed among rough equals in the senatorial class. But as power consolidated under the emperors, these tactics increasingly became top-down instruments of control. The emperor and his inner circle could use sexual accusations to eliminate threats and enforce compliance among the broader elite. The infamous treason trials, maiestas, of the early empire frequently incorporated allegations of sexual misconduct, not because the sexual behavior itself constituted treason, but because it could be presented as evidence of a broader pattern of moral corruption that might eventually lead to political disloyalty. Under Tiberius, this connection became particularly explicit. The case of Albacilla in 37 CE illustrates the pattern. She was accused of adultery with several prominent senators who were then investigated for both adultery and treason. The implication was clear. Sexual misconduct and political unreliability went hand in hand. But as these tactics became more institutionalized, they also became more predictable, and some targets developed sophisticated counter-strategies. The case of Gaius Piso during Nero's reign demonstrates both the danger and the potential for resistance. Piso was an aristocrat from an ancient family who maintained a degree of independence that Nero found threatening. Rather than directly attacking such a well-connected figure, Nero's circle began circulating rumors about Piso's private life, particularly his marriage to Satria Galla, who had previously been married to Domitius Silus. The narrative they constructed suggested that Piso had pressured Silas to divorce Galla so Piso could marry her. an action that could be presented as both sexually predatory and politically arrogant. The implication was that a man who would steal another man's wife would also steal another man's throne. Recognizing the existential threat these rumors represented, Piso orchestrated a conspiracy to assassinate Nero and replace him with a more Senate-friendly emperor. The plot failed, and Piso was forced to commit suicide. But his case illustrates how sexual humiliation could sometimes backfire by pushing targets to desperate measures. This brings us to a crucial insight. The weaponization of sexual humiliation created a political environment where reputation management became a life-or-death skill for anyone near the center of power. This wasn't just metaphorical. A damaged reputation could lead directly to forced suicide or execution. The pressure this created helps explain some otherwise puzzling aspects of Roman elite behavior, particularly their obsessive concern with projecting an image of perfect self-mastery. What might seem like philosophical posturing or moral hypocrisy makes more practical sense when understood as a survival strategy in a political ecosystem where reputation was both primary currency and primary target. This dynamic created particular challenges for women in imperial circles who had to navigate contradictory expectations. The ideal Roman matrona was supposed to exercise influence through private counsel while maintaining an image of perfect virtue and deference. Step too far into visible political action, and you risked being portrayed as sexually domineering. Retreat too far into traditional female roles, and you sacrificed real influence. Consider the contrasting strategies of two formidable imperial women, Livia, wife of Augustus, and Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. Livia maintained power for decades by working through proxies, avoiding direct confrontation, and cultivating an image of traditional Roman womanhood even while amassing significant influence. She was never formally charged with sexual misconduct, despite outliving two emperors and seeing her son Tiberius ascend to the throne. Agrippina took a more direct approach, openly participating in state business and demanding recognition of her status. This made her a more obvious target. Nero's advisors, particularly Seneca and Burrus, recognized that the fastest way to undermine Agrippina was to attack her sexual reputation, portraying her as attempting to seduce her own son to maintain control over him. The contrast is revealing. Livia's indirect exercise of power helped her avoid the most damaging forms of sexual humiliation, while Agrippina's more overt political ambition made her vulnerable to attacks that eventually proved fatal. As the imperial system matured, we see increasing sophistication in how sexual humiliation was both deployed and countered. By the Flavian dynasty, 69 to 96 CE, some emperors recognized that obvious use of sexual accusations for political purposes could itself damage imperial legitimacy. Vespasian, who took power after the chaos of the Year of Four Emperors, deliberately distanced himself from the sexual politics of the Julio-Claudian period. Rather than using sexual accusations to eliminate rivals, he emphasized his own straightforward, unpretentious character, a strategy that helped legitimize his rule despite his relatively humble origins. His son Domitian, however, returned to sexual accusations as a political weapon, reviving the use of morals charges against potential opponents. This approach contributed to the climate of fear and resentment that ultimately led to his assassination in 96 CE. What emerges from this historical pattern is a recognition that sexual humiliation was not just a political tactic, but a governance strategy, one that could either enhance or undermine regime stability depending on how it was deployed. Used sparingly and against carefully chosen targets, it could eliminate specific threats while reinforcing broader norms. Used too broadly or transparently, it could create a climate of general fear that paradoxically increased the risk to the emperor himself. This strategic calculation helps explain why some emperors relied heavily on sexual accusations, while others largely avoided them. It wasn't just a matter of personal temperament, but of political judgment about how best to secure their position. By the 2nd century CE, during the period of the Five Good Emperors, we see a general retreat from sexual accusations as a primary political weapon. Emperors like Trajan and Hadrian certainly weren't above using character assassination when necessary, but they relied less on sexual humiliation and more on other forms of political management. This shift suggests a system that had matured beyond its earlier reliance on the most destructive forms of reputation warfare, perhaps because the imperial position had become secure enough that the constant elimination of rivals through scandal was no longer necessary. We've covered how sexual humiliation functioned in elite Roman politics, but a critical question remains. Why was this particular form of attack so devastatingly effective in the Roman context? The answer lies in understanding the distinctive Roman conception of the self and its relationship to social standing. For the Roman elite, particularly men, the self wasn't primarily an internal psychological entity as we might understand it today. Instead, it was fundamentally social, constructed through and reflected in the perceptions of others. A Roman senator didn't just have a reputation. In many ways, he was his reputation. This explains why attacks on dignitas, dignity status, or existimatio, reputation, weren't just embarrassing but existentially threatening. They didn't just damage how a person was perceived. They damaged who that person fundamentally was in the social reality of Rome. Sexual humiliation was particularly potent because Roman sexual ethics weren't about consent or mutual pleasure, as modern sexual ethics often are. They were about power, dominance, and proper role fulfillment. Sexual behavior was expected to mirror and reinforce social hierarchies, the free-born Roman male citizen in the active role, with women, slaves, and foreigners in passive roles. This meant that allegations of sexual impropriety weren't just about breaking moral rules, they suggested a fundamental misalignment between a person's social position and their bodily practices. For a Roman audience, this was more than scandalous. It was almost ontologically disturbing, suggesting a rupture in the proper order of society. The effectiveness of these attacks was amplified by the physical layout of Roman elite life. Despite their wealth, upper-class Romans lived in remarkably public ways. The typical elite domus, house, was designed for public reception, with clients and visitors moving freely through much of the space. Privacy as we understand it was limited, and the boundaries between public and private life were porous. This architectural reality reinforced the social reality. A Roman nobleman was always performing his identity, always under potential observation, always vulnerable to having his actions reinterpreted and his reputation reconfigured by others. The ever-present audience for elite Roman life included both peers, other senators and equites, and dependents, clients, freedmen, and slaves. Both groups could serve as witnesses to behavior that might later be characterized as inappropriate, creating a surveillance network that few actions could entirely escape. This helps explain why sexual accusations were so difficult to definitively refute. In a social world of constant observation and gossip, the absence of witnesses to inappropriate behavior was never conclusive. There was always the possibility that someone had seen something and would come forward later. The Roman legal system reinforced these dynamics. In cases involving sexual misconduct, slave testimony was admissible, and slaves could be tortured to extract such testimony. This created a particularly vulnerable position for elite men, whose own households contained potential witnesses who could be compelled to testify against them under extreme duress. It's worth noting that while we focused primarily on how sexual humiliation affected men in the political sphere, women faced even more severe consequences for perceived sexual misconduct. For elite women, sexual reputation wasn't just about political standing, but about legal status and physical safety. The infamous case of the Vestal Virgins in 114 BCE illustrates these stakes. When several Vestals were accused of breaking their vows of chastity, the consequences weren't merely political. Those found guilty were buried alive, a punishment that reflected the perceived religious pollution their actions had created. While few women faced consequences quite so extreme, many experienced significant legal and social penalties for perceived sexual transgressions. Augustus's adultery law, Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, created different standards for men and women. A husband could kill his wife's lover if caught in the act under certain circumstances, and women convicted of adultery could lose up to a third of their property and be relegated to an island. This legal framework made sexual accusations particularly dangerous for women in imperial politics. Once formally accused, they faced potential consequences that went far beyond reputation damage to include exile, impoverishment, or even death. The case of Julia the Elder, Augustus's daughter, demonstrates these stakes. Accused of adultery and treason in 2 BCE, she was exiled to the island of Pandateria under harsh conditions that eventually led to her death. While the exact nature of her crimes remains contested, they may have involved genuine adultery, political conspiracy, or simply running afoul of her father's dynastic plans. The mechanism of her fall was sexual accusation. What makes Julia's case particularly poignant is that she had been raised to be the living embodiment of her father's moral legislation. As the daughter of the princeps, who had made adultery a public crime, her alleged sexual misconduct wasn't just a personal failing, but a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the new imperial order. This pattern, where those closest to power faced the most severe consequences for alleged sexual misconduct, repeated throughout the imperial period. Proximity to the emperor created both opportunity and vulnerability, with sexual accusation serving as the mechanism through which that vulnerability could be exploited. By the later empire, these dynamics had become so institutionalized that sexual accusations against political rivals were almost ritualized, expected elements of succession struggles and power transitions rather than exceptional events. This institutionalization actually created a certain predictability that could work to the advantage of savvy political operators. Those who understood the system could sometimes preemptively neutralize potential sexual accusations through careful reputation management and strategic counter-narratives. The Emperor Hadrian, for example, managed potential criticism of his relationship with Antinous by transforming what could have been a political liability into a religious asset after Antinous' death. By deifying his favorite and associating his cult with traditional Roman values of loyalty and devotion, Hadrian redirected potential criticism into a narrative that actually enhanced imperial prestige. This sophisticated approach to managing potentially damaging narratives represents the culmination of centuries of experience with sexual politics as a central arena of power struggles in Rome. What had begun as an ad hoc tactic in Republican political combat had evolved into a recognized dimension of imperial governance, one that capable emperors learned to navigate just as they navigated military strategy or economic policy. We've been exploring how Roman elites weaponized sexual humiliation against their political enemies. But there's an important dimension we haven't yet addressed: the role of literature and oratory in both perpetuating and contesting these narratives. The pen, in Rome as elsewhere, was often mightier than the sword, particularly when it came to reputation warfare. Roman literature wasn't just entertainment. It was a primary battlefield for establishing historical memory and moral evaluation. The works that have survived to the modern era represent only a fraction of what circulated in ancient Rome, but they provide crucial insights into how sexual humiliation functioned as both political tactic and literary trope. Cicero's speeches offer perhaps the most sophisticated examples of how sexual accusations could be weaponized in a literary format. His attacks on Mark Antony in the Philippics don't just criticize Antony's policies. They paint a vivid picture of moral dissolution, featuring Antony vomiting in public, stumbling drunk through official functions, and engaging in inappropriate sexual relationships. These weren't just random insults, but carefully crafted character studies designed to undermine Antony's claim to legitimate authority. By portraying him as enslaved to his physical appetites, Cicero implied he was unfit for public responsibility. A man who couldn't control himself couldn't be trusted to control the state. The effectiveness of Cicero's literary attack is evidenced by the fact that Antony had him executed when he gained power, and allegedly had Cicero's hands, which had written the Philippics, nailed separately to the rostra in the Forum. This wasn't just personal vengeance, but the elimination of a man who had demonstrated the devastating potential of well-crafted literary humiliation. But formal oratory wasn't the only literary vehicle for sexual humiliation. Poetry served as a particularly effective channel for accusations that might be too scandalous or legally dangerous to present in more official formats. Catullus, writing in the late Republic, pioneered what we might call political gossip poetry, using his literary talents to skewer prominent figures through sexual innuendo and explicit accusations. His attacks on Julius Caesar and his lieutenant Mamurra are so sexually explicit that they remained untranslated in many English editions until the late 20th century. What makes Catullus's approach particularly noteworthy is how he blended personal invective with political commentary. His poems attacking Caesar weren't just about sexual behavior, but about what that behavior supposedly revealed about Caesar's political character and ambitions. This poetic tradition continued into the imperial period with figures like Martial, whose epigrams often contained sexual humor with political undertones. While Martial was generally careful to avoid directly attacking the emperor or his immediate circle, his work maintained the tradition of using sexual humiliation as social commentary. The satirist Juvenal took this approach even further, using graphic sexual accusations to paint a picture of Roman moral decline under imperial rule. His second satire, which attacks male homosexual behavior among the Roman elite, isn't just about sexual ethics, but about what he presents as the hypocrisy and corruption of the ruling class. Critically, this literary tradition didn't just reflect existing sexual politics. It actively shaped them, establishing tropes and narrative patterns that influenced how actual political accusations were framed and received. Literature and life existed in a feedback loop, each informing the other's understanding of how sexual behavior related to political standing. This literary dimension helps explain why sexual humiliation remained such an effective political weapon despite its predictable nature. Even as targets became more sophisticated in anticipating and countering such attacks, the cultural narratives surrounding sexual transgression retained their power because they were constantly being reinforced through popular literature. The biographer Suetonius represents perhaps the culmination of this tradition. His Lives of the 12 Caesars, written during the reign of Hadrian, collects and catalogues alleged sexual misconduct by Rome's first emperors with an almost encyclopedic thoroughness. Ancient sources, often hostile and written decades later, allege numerous sexual improprieties by various emperors. Scholars consider many of these contested. What makes Suetonius significant isn't just his thoroughness, but his methodology. He presents sexual anecdotes not as salacious gossip, but as important character evidence that helps explain political decisions and outcomes. In his narrative framework, Tiberius's alleged sexual practices on Capri aren't just scandalous personal details, but keys to understanding his withdrawal from active governance and the resulting rise of figures like Sejanus. This approach, using sexual behavior as an explanatory framework for political events, became the template for much subsequent Roman historiography. By the later empire, it was almost impossible to discuss political history without addressing the sexual narratives that had become inextricably intertwined with it. But literature didn't just perpetuate sexual humiliation as a political weapon, it also provided avenues for contesting and reframing damaging narratives. The poet Ovid, for example, created in his Ars Amatoria a sophisticated counter-narrative to Augustus's moral legislation, suggesting that sexual pleasure and traditional Roman values weren't necessarily in conflict. Ovid paid a heavy price for this literary intervention, exiled to Tomis on the Black Sea, but his work represents an important reminder that sexual politics in Rome wasn't just imposed from above. It was a contested terrain where different visions of Roman identity and values competed for cultural dominance. Even historical writing could serve this contestatory function. Tacitus's presentation of the Empress Messalina, while certainly not sympathetic, subtly shifts responsibility for her alleged excesses onto the Emperor Claudius, whose inattention and weakness allowed others to abuse power in his name. This wasn't just historical analysis, but political commentary on the dangers of disengaged leadership. What emerges from examining the literary dimension of Roman sexual politics is a recognition that reputation wasn't just something that existed in the minds of contemporaries. It was actively produced through texts that continued to shape perceptions long after the individuals involved had died. This explains why figures like Caesar or Augustus invested so heavily in creating their own literary narratives through autobiographies, commissioned histories, and patronage of poets like Virgil and Horace. They recognized that controlling the literary record was crucial to controlling how their sexual and political character would be remembered. The lesson here isn't just that literature reflected political reality, but that literature was political reality. A central arena where reputation was constructed, contested, and consolidated. The true masters of Roman political warfare were those who could not just win momentary advantages through scandalous accusations, but shape enduring narratives that defined how historical figures would be remembered by posterity. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, it's worth asking, what can this deep dive into Roman sexual politics teach us about power, reputation, and political combat more broadly? The Roman case isn't just a historical curiosity. It reveals fundamental dynamics that recur throughout political history, albeit in culturally specific forms. First, the Roman experience demonstrates how sexual behavior becomes politically significant when it can be framed as revealing something about capacity for leadership. The specific sexual norms change across time and culture, but the underlying logic remains. Private conduct is made politically relevant by connecting it to public responsibilities. In Rome, a man who took a passive sexual role was portrayed as incapable of asserting authority in government. The specifics of this equation were culturally contingent, but the structure of the argument, connecting private behavior to public capacity, has proven remarkably durable across different political systems. Second, the Roman case reveals the asymmetrical power of accusation versus denial. Throughout our examples, we've seen how difficult it was for targets to definitively refute sexual allegations once they gained circulation. This asymmetry created a political environment where preemptive reputation management was essential for survival. This dynamic helps explain the careful public performance of virtue by Roman elites. What might seem like hypocrisy was often a rational response to a political system where the mere suggestion of impropriety could be career-ending or even fatal. When accusations don't need to be proven to be damaging, performing unimpeachable virtue becomes a necessary defense strategy. Third, the evolution of sexual politics from republic to empire demonstrates how changes in political structure transform the function of reputation warfare. As power concentrated around the emperor, sexual humiliation evolved from a horizontal competition among senators to a top-down mechanism of control wielded by the imperial court. This pattern, where the mechanics of humiliation reflect broader power structures, suggests that sexual politics isn't just about cultural attitudes toward sex, but about how authority is distributed and contested within a political system. Perhaps most significantly, the Roman experience illustrates how sexual humiliation functions as a proxy for more direct forms of political competition. When constitutional norms or power imbalances make it difficult to openly contest authority, attacking character through sexual allegations offers an indirect channel for political combat. During the transition from republic to empire, Romans couldn't easily question the growing power of the emperors directly, but they could tell stories about sexual excess that implicitly challenged imperial legitimacy. Sexual narratives became the vehicle through which fundamental political questions about power and authority could be obliquely addressed. This proxy function helps explain why sexual politics often becomes most intense during periods of political transition or uncertainty. When the rules of the political game are in flux, reputation becomes both more vulnerable and more crucial, creating the perfect conditions for sexual humiliation to flourish as a political tactic. The Roman case also reveals something important about the relationship between sexual politics and historical memory. Many of our sources for Roman history, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, wrote decades or even centuries after the events they describe. Their accounts reflect not just what happened, but how subsequent generations interpreted and reframed those events. This time lag created space for sexual narratives to evolve from immediate political attacks into enduring historical judgments. What began as tactical character assassination became, through literary repetition and elaboration, the definitive account of historical figures and periods. This process continues to shape how we understand Roman history today. When we think of Caligula or Nero, we're not accessing unmediated historical truth, but navigating layers of reputation warfare that have accumulated over centuries. The effectiveness of ancient sexual humiliation campaigns is demonstrated by their continued influence on modern historical understanding. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Roman experience is the recognition that sexual humiliation wasn't just a reflection of Roman sexual attitudes. It was a mechanism through which those attitudes were enforced and reproduced. The constant threat of being labeled sexually deviant created powerful incentives to conform to expected gender and sexual norms. This enforcement function helps explain why sexual humiliation tended to target boundary crossers of various kinds: politicians who adopted new styles, women who sought unconventional influence, outsiders who gained unexpected power. Sexual accusations became the means to police the boundaries of acceptable Roman identity and behavior. In this sense, sexual humiliation wasn't just a weapon in political conflicts that were fundamentally about other issues. It was itself a central arena where Romans contested the definition of proper masculinity, femininity, and citizenship. The struggle wasn't just over who would hold power, but over what kind of people were entitled to power in the first place. This recognition complicates the common perception that Romans were simply hypocritical about sexual behavior, publicly condemning what they privately practiced. While there was certainly hypocrisy, the more fundamental dynamic was a continuous negotiation over which sexual norms would be enforced, against whom, and to what political ends. The weaponization of sexual humiliation in Roman politics reveals a society deeply invested in maintaining certain power hierarchies while allowing considerable latitude for those who knew how to navigate the system's complexities. It wasn't simply that sexual rules were broken behind closed doors. It was that the application of those rules was fundamentally political, uneven, and strategic. This strategic dimension explains why figures like Julius Caesar could survive and even thrive despite sexual allegations that might have destroyed less skilled politicians. The most successful Roman politicians weren't necessarily those who perfectly embodied traditional sexual virtues, but those who could manage their sexual reputation effectively within the prevailing political culture. As we conclude our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what the Roman experience suggests about the relationship between sexual politics and political stability. The increasingly vicious deployment of sexual humiliation during the late Republic correlates with the breakdown of constitutional norms and the eventual collapse of Republican government. While sexual humiliation didn't cause this collapse, it both reflected and accelerated the deterioration of political trust and cooperation that made republican self-government impossible. When character assassination becomes the default mode of political competition, the space for substantive policy debate and compromise inevitably shrinks. The lesson here isn't that politics should be entirely divorced from questions of character. Roman insights about how private behavior might reflect capacity for public service aren't without merit. Rather, it's that when character assessment becomes unmoored from verifiable evidence and procedural fairness, it can undermine the trust necessary for functional politics. The Roman elites who engineered erotic humiliations against their enemies were practicing a form of politics that prioritized victory over specific opponents rather than the health of the political system itself. The short-term advantages this approach offered eventually gave way to long-term systemic damage, a lesson that remains relevant whenever personal attacks threaten to overwhelm substantive political discourse. Yet even as we recognize these dangers, the Roman case also reminds us that reputation, character, and personal conduct have always been legitimate concerns in political life. The question isn't whether such factors should matter, but how they should be evaluated, through what processes, with what evidence, and with what connection to actual governance capacity. The Romans never fully resolved these questions, and neither have subsequent political systems. The tension between personal character and public function, between private conduct and political capacity, remains a central challenge of political life, one that the Roman experience illuminates but doesn't definitively resolve. What the Romans do offer is a vivid illustration of both the power and the danger of weaponizing intimate behavior for political ends. Their experience stands as both warning and insight into how sexual politics reflects, reinforces, and sometimes undermines broader political structures, a lesson that retains its relevance across the centuries that separate their world from our own. If this unpacked some myths, a like helps more people find it. Subscribe for the next chapter, and drop a comment with the rumor you want covered next.